Thank you, everybody. This is the 115 panel, Enrich Your Products and Services with Data Wrapping. It's moderated by Barbara Haley Wixom, who is, Principal Research Scientist for the MIT Center for Information Systems and Research. I'm going to basically turn it over to her and have her introduce the subject and our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. We are thrilled you could join us today. It is clear that we do not have to make the case for the importance of data. For those of you who just sat through the morning sessions as I did, it is incredible how the role of data is elevated in our organizations. But what we found at the Center for IS Research is that the role of data is also changing. For years and years and years and years, our research has been focusing on creating evidence-based cultures and applying data capabilities internal to the firm to improve operational efficiencies, whether that be through BI, analytics, big data, and such. But things are changing in this digital world. And as we are competing in new ways, and as we have these new opportunities around Internet of Things and cognitive computing and such, we now are starting to look at data as a part of our products. In fact, we are using and relying on digitization to create distinct products, to compete as organization and run away from commoditization. We are also pursuing possible revenue streams from direct productization and selling of data. Now, when you think about wrapping, enriching products with data as well as selling, fundamentally, these are different animals. And as such, we can think about our own organizations and wonder, are we really set up to do these well? And what we find in our organizations or in our research is that we're not. We have to make some changes. And so as researchers, we are thinking to ourselves, how can we help firms understand how we must change in order to leverage these new opportunities? And we thought, there's a set of companies out there that know how to productize data and analytics. There are companies that are really good around being competitive with information, and those are information businesses. And so the purpose of today is to learn from companies who are very good at the kinds of things we all now need to do in order to create competitive features for our products and services. So please join me in welcoming our four panelists. We're going to, I think, have some really nice discussions. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is have each of them talk a little bit about themselves, their organization, and how their organization delivers value through data. We're going to start with Ivan Matviak, who is with State Street's Global Exchange. And Global Exchange is a very exciting new division of State Street that was launched in 2013 for the purposes of productizing data analytics. So Ivan, can you talk a little bit about your company and how you all create value with data?
Sure, happy to. Thanks for having me here. For those of you who may not be tremendously familiar with State Street, probably one of the largest global banks in the world that few people have heard of, we are a global custodian. So one of our core businesses is providing administration and custody services for large global investment managers, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, the like. We also have a large investment management business called Global Advisors, which has about $2.3 trillion in assets under management. We have a trading business, which we call Global Markets, and our newest division, which we call Global Exchange. We launched Global Exchange about 3 years ago, and the real focus of that business is on, Barbara, exactly what you talked about, data and analytics. It's helping provide our clients, investment managers, with better insights and information so that they can perform their businesses better and generate better returns. And as we've built this business over the last couple of years, we've seen, I think, two real sort of commercial benefits for us and ultimately, hopefully, for our clients. One is that by doing some of this wrapping, creating some of these data products, we're able to enhance the value of our core services, the things that we already provide, the accounting, the custody, the analytics capabilities, because it makes them stickier for the client, and it provides a richer set of services for them. But also it provides a new and standalone revenue stream for us, and has allowed us to penetrate new markets. And I can talk a little bit later about some of the types of products that we've created.
Great, thank you, Ivan. Our next panelist is Mona Vernon from Thomson Reuters Labs. And Mona, I was excited to have for her a part of the panel, because a key component for this new leveraging the value of data is around innovation. And so who best to talk about innovation than someone in charge of Innovation Labs? But Mona, can you talk about your role and a little bit about Thomson Reuters?
Sure. So I'm glad to be back on campus. So Thomson Reuters is a large information service provider. We serve basically professionals or knowledge workers. So we sell to financial services. We support lawyers, tax professionals, and we are really in the business of giving them information to make better decisions. The labs were set up really in this idea that increasingly with the rise of the machine and with new technologies, there is an opportunity to shift the role between the way you automate or use analytics and provide a little more of that service on top of the information. And as well as the desire from some of our customers, like in financial services, to start building insights, not only from the data we provide or they buy traditionally, but from all these new sources of data. So can you get a sense of commodity prices by gleaning into all this IoT data, for instance? And those are real conversations that are starting to emerge. And in order to do that, there is a lot of uncertainty, but a lot of opportunity. So being able to do this in a manner that is essentially agile and done around rapid experimentation with customers is critical in order to do this sort of sense-making. So the lab's mission is really to work very closely with our customers to really understand what they're looking for, and in order to start defining the type of data wrapped products that we can start delivering with them or for them.
Thank you. And I'm going to be talking a bit about some of the key areas of competency that we think companies need in order to wrap well. One of those areas, I'll just say right now to give it away, is the idea of being customer savvy. And so ideas that Mona will be able to share in a bit around that customer savviness and how you build that is critical to making sure that you are differentiating your products in the right way in your analytics types of offerings. So our next panelist is Damon ONeil, and Damon is the head of product for Vertica. And what we're finding in organizations as they move to wrapping is the need for incredible platforms for their data and analytics. Jeannie Ross at Scissor has done some work on, and her colleagues, and many have done work on digital services platforms. And digital services platforms, in many cases, involve types of technologies like Vertica. So Damon, can you talk a little bit about your organization and this idea of what you're seeing also in your customers?
Our organization was born here about 11 years ago. Vertica was invented at MIT, and it's now part of the software division of Hewlett Packard Enterprise. So I'm on the panel because we have many customers now that have recently moved along your journey from improving to wrapping to selling. I think particularly a storage provider that is a customer of ours, and they were facing increasing commoditization and now have developed a whole independent revenue stream because of this movement. It started out with them trying to improve their customer service. They had an elaborate phone home system back to their customers where they would gather something like hundreds of thousands of data points per minute about how the parts in the disks were spinning. And this helped them to figure out patterns of failures and help their engineers to design the product better in the next release. But they quickly turned this into a conversation with their customers because they started giving them advice about, they sell two kinds of products, a flash array and a hybrid array. they started looking at the data, doing analytics with Vertica, and telling their customers, we noticed that this workload in the cloud would do better if you use the hybrid array, and that other workload should use the flash array. So this was the wrapping phase where they pretty quickly started to be able to give their customers advice about the mixture of products to deploy. Then they, because they'd improved their processes and their support got better, it actually freed up a lot of their analysts and scientists to think more about the data. And so then they started coming up with new insights, and they quickly started becoming a trusted advisor to the CFOs at these companies, because they started to give them advice about their 5-year budgets for purchasing equipment. And they'd be telling them what kind of equipment they should be looking to lease or to buy based on their workloads.
It's interesting. And what I want to make sure we come back to is this idea of wrapping to selling. We see that pattern that you just described quite a bit, and it seems like a big challenge is when to wrap and when to sell. So
I can talk later about how some of the competencies they developed as they changed from that. Yeah.
That would be wonderful. And then our fourth panelist is James Powell, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Nielsen. I think it's pretty clear. We all know that Nielsen is in the information business. Can you tell a little about your role in the organization and what you're facing in today's competitive environment, James?
Well, I think the interesting thing about Nielsen is it's a measurement company. Two big areas. One is around media, watch the Nielsen family, I think everybody in the US knows. And then on the manufacturing and retail side, measuring how products are selling and helping manufacturers and retailers understand market share. So what's interesting is that those products, those data products, were usually delivered through people, through building reports, paper, web pages, rather than the data product itself. And I think the reason I came to Nielsen, which is just a year ago now, was because Nielsen wanted to become much more savvy about how to deliver in an enterprise context data to make it easy to use, because companies wanted to use that to drive their systems themselves. And so it's a natural evolution away from that people-delivered process to automation, very similar to Thomson Reuters in some ways.
Yeah. So both of you actually, both Eamon and James, the idea of productization, creating an actual data product, what does it take to do that? Because it's one thing to have a data resource that we can use internally in order to improve ourselves, but you can also get away with quite a bit when you're using data internally. You can ignore some data issues at times, you learn how to work around at times, but as soon as you have customers involved, it seems like the game changes. So I don't know if you want to start, James, in terms of how you actually create data and make it really into a product at the level that you would expect a product to be.
So there's many aspects of this, right? I think one of the most interesting things that I've experienced is how well the company's integrated the data internally. So often these companies, my company, Nielsen, Thomson Reuters, where I worked before, are built through acquisition. And so a lot of the artifacts of the legacy systems which exist to support customers tend to exist in the data, and often that's hidden in a terminal by careful presentation of that data. But when you get to do a data product, all of a sudden those kind of artifacts show up. So I think the first thing is modeling the data to make it consistent and well managed across the data set you're delivering. I think the second question is how easy is it to consume that data? Quite often I think you'll see an ecosystem of companies that solve the problems of lack of investment in the data models associated with the data. So I think it's important to think about how that data is going to be used. And I also think it's important to think about the abstraction level at which you deliver the data. You can deliver bulk files, you can deliver APIs, you can deliver data as a service, right? And you've got to decide what's right for your customers. Ease of integration, cost of ownership, those kind of things is a very complex set of challenges depending on what problem you're trying to solve, right?
Yeah. Eamon, how did you see the organization change, the one that you used as your example? What do they actually have to do in order to progress from that productization perspective?
Developing sales skills is one of the most important things, because often what you're doing when you're selling these information products is you're benchmarking each of your customers against the rest. That's something they will pay for. They like to know how they're comparing in the use of their product to the other customers. But you don't want to just have the data scientists deliver that raw message, because they're not always going to be on top. So it takes some sales skills in how you package that information. And so that was a change for them. I think the other thing you have to develop is make sure that you're not just passing the data back to the customers you collected from, which is some simple filtering. You have to aggregate it, you have to net it out and deliver insights with it. So I have another customer example where they're a company that gathers a lot of network data for telco companies, and they try to help them. They started out by trying to help them understand why faults would happen. And at the first one, what they would wrap and try to sell was some of these companies would produce 90,000 alarms per day. And their value they added was they would analyze them and tell them the small subset of alarms that they needed to pay attention to, because nobody can check on 90,000. But their customers weren't willing to pay all that much for that first data product, because that was just a simple filtering. They had more success when they were then able to run some analytics to tell these customers about their network performance over time. So when you have a fault or a day where there's a traffic problem or performance problem, the insights need to tell them how bad it is compared to prior events. How did that compare to the same day the previous week? How did that compare to the last time the alarm went off? So you need to make sure that you're not simply passing back, that you're really aggregating.
The other thing I was just going to, you reminded me that one of the things I always forget about, because I'm a nerd, is the legal aspects of data, the usage and what you can and can't do with the data and how you can combine the data with other sources. Reuters has been very clever about that, and I think Nielsen is actually trying to work out how to do that in a way which protects the intellectual property. I think there's a lot of belief that data is somehow commodity and therefore should be, we get it and we can do what we like with it. But actually that encapsulates all the IP that Nielsen has built over 100 years, right? So I think it's very important to get that right as well.
Interesting. So Ivan, you've made this journey. For you, it's been a very dramatic journey in terms of moving from State Street into an actual formal entity, another structure. Can you talk about that movement that you've gone in and gone through and what it's taken in order to get to where you are today?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we set up Global Exchange about 3 years ago. And when we looked at the opportunity in these areas, we did a lot of the strategy work and decided that it was a big opportunity, and so we made a large commitment to move into the space. So we actually set up the first new division within State Street in 30 years, and decided to really have a separate organization that was going to focus on this. So our approach first was to set up the new division, right? We brought in teams from around the organization. We were doing some of these types of things already. We had researchers and data scientists within the bank. We had some information products already. We had some analytical tools, but they weren't all coming together in an integrated way, and they weren't presenting a consistent face and message to the market. So we brought all of these pieces together. We pulled teams and P&Ls out of the rest of the organization and put them into this new division. We stood it up with pretty substantial investment to grow the business. And we also decided that, from a commercial point of view, it would need to be separate. And one of the challenges we had in the way we had been selling some of these things before was that they were bundled with other services. Their value was being lost or masked in what were, in many cases, larger ticket items. And we didn't feel like we were actually realizing some of the value that was in these assets. So by bringing them together, it allowed us to separate them out and really focus on the commercials that were relevant to this.
So can I ask a little bit, because this is really interesting, because a lot of us in the room who are thinking about moving into wrapping, ultimately, if there's an evolution and potentially there's selling in the future, how do you prevent from getting your customers used to getting things for free? Or how do you unbundle? So you build to a product, but then unbundle it as its own product. Was that hard? Is that something that? How did you work through that dynamic?
It's very hard in many cases. Some of these items are given away within contracts that we have with the clients. So it's an ongoing journey that we're going through. The first part was to separate them out, brand them as separate entities, create separate rate cards and P&Ls around these things so that we could talk to the clients about the value. We had to do an enormous amount of work with the product teams and the sales organization so that they could talk about the value of these assets in an independent way. and then they just spend a lot of time with the client. So in many cases, and I think one of the gentlemen alluded to it, you're kind of giving away some of the basics, right? Because they were already getting that. And part of our strategy was to continue to enhance the capabilities, so create broader, deeper sets of data. And while we may give away some base set of data, for example, as a bundle in another product, that gets them interested in some of the capabilities, and then you're upselling and cross-selling more sophisticated data.
So in evolving the value prop, and this is where I'd love to get some input from Mona. So again, in our research, we found that this productization piece is really, really important. But then the second area of capability is the idea of really being able to serve customers. And it's interesting, we hear a lot about solving customer problems, meeting customer needs, and that's in fact happening. But what we see in information businesses is more than that. It's going beyond, it's not just delivering solution, but delivering the results too. Or at least having accountability or maybe just ownership that results happen. So there's an almost aggressiveness in the way information businesses solve customer problems and meet their needs. But to do that, you really have to know your customers well. And so I suspect, again, this is what's going on with this customer-focused lab. So Mona, can you talk a little bit about how do you learn from your customers? How do you make sure that you can really drive through to making sure that they are changing in the way they need to change and applying your products in the way they need to?
Yeah, so I think, we serve very different segments, with very different challenges. I think there's a tremendous amount of change happening in the financial industry and this notion of rising competition from fintech. But we're also seeing that very conservative customer segment like law firms are really thinking about how data can enable them to be more efficient. Fundamentally, the reality of it is that although we do sell and we're very careful about doing a good job at solution selling, in order to look at this new space, you do need to build this level of ambidexterity and have conversations that are different. So it is difficult, but it's actually orchestrated in a way where we go in and say, look, we don't have anything to sell here. We really want to understand the problems you're facing. And look to see how to help you with it. And our value proposition is the fact that we have a really deep understanding of data management, that at the end of it, that's the hardest part of the analytics. We spend a lot of time trying to fix that problem. But that there is actually a lot of subtlety about the way you might want to productize something. So one of the recent projects we did, we ended up doing a pivot between the way how much automation was delivered to a lawyer's workflow and sort of the line between a decision support tool to one that might actually really sort of replace a persona. And those things are things that are really happening through this rapid experimentation, through a lot of conversations by contrasting, through just an incredible amount of engagement. And in some cases, we have had some really fantastic success, even in our core business, taking customers from inception to launch of the product. We just recently did this in our legal services, and the reason being that all along the journey from inception to go to market, there were subtle learning that really shaped our strategy. So I think it's just the only way you can manage a lot of the uncertainty is to be very close, and also, frankly, having a different approach, which is all about transparency. Like, we are experimenting, we're trying to do this with you. There isn't a sell here, but a willingness to jointly find a solution.
Yeah, very good. This idea of agility and speed, that's come up quite a bit in terms of what's important as we try to differentiate our products and services. And cloud seems to be very helpful with this. I mean, Eamon, why cloud? I mean, how is this going to help us move forward in terms of, from that agility perspective?
I think it really enables experimentation. So we have many customers that said they needed sort of a fixed installation of Vertica for their everyday BI needs, and they couldn't really rapidly expand it or shrink it without negatively affecting the typical BI. So when they would come to the end of the month and they'd want to get these insights for their information product, it typically involved many hours of intense computation. They would use the advanced analytic functions in Vertica to come up with these new insights, but they didn't want to do it in the same data mart that they used for their BI needs. So the cloud, at this point, there are hundreds and hundreds of Vertica customers running on Amazon and some other clouds. It allows them to just spin up a few nodes of computation very quickly, keep it for just a few hours or a day, and then throw it away when they're done, when they've got the answer. They don't need to keep the data there, they just need to get the answer.
Yeah. So, please.
I just wanted to touch on that because I think there's, when companies are thinking about using the cloud themselves, there's a lot of naivete about what the cloud can do for you and what some of the risks are of the cloud. And I think it's important to be careful and sort of learn about how you want to use it. Do you want to use it for storage, which can ultimately be very expensive if you're not watching what you're doing, or using it for more sort of burst analytics purposes? So I think there's a lot of enormous benefits in the cloud, but when firms are first starting to think about how they can use the cloud, you got to go in with eyes wide open and know what some of the pitfalls can be too.
Purposeful cloud.
Yeah.
Purposeful cloud.
The other benefit they got was actually back to the consulting company that was studying network performance. The cloud allowed them to get diverse data sets that they wouldn't have gotten in the past. So they were able to make predictions about traffic on their customers' network in the next few days by pulling in weather data. So they didn't just get the data from their customers, they combined it with weather data. And a few years ago, you wouldn't have been able to get that, but there are now a lot of open source APIs that will give you weather forecasts.
Yeah. So I want to take us to another area of competency, which is incredibly important as we are, again, starting to wrap, and that's the area of risk. And not the risk that we just discussed in the previous panel, where there was a heavy bent towards security and privacy and such. Those are table stakes for these kinds of organizations. I mean, at the end of the day, when we go in our research to information businesses like those represented, they're like tanks. I mean, they are tanks because they appreciate that credibility really relies upon security and privacy. However, what's been really interesting for the research team are these emergent data risks. And we're finding that risk management practices really have to change as we start to wrap and compete based on these digital features. For one, we have to start managing data, not just that we consume and curate as a firm, but the data that we are sending outside our boundaries. And so we become responsible for data that might have been off our radar before, but now we have to really be careful around the controls we have on place. We have to be really careful about creepiness. And especially if we're talking about consumer-based wrapping as we're adding digital features, and the idea of appropriately using features, and how do we determine as a firm what's appropriate? I mean, these are really tough challenges, and I could go on and on. There were quite a few of these data-related emergent risks coming out where regulation doesn't really help us, and we have to go back to values-based types of approaches in order to figure out what to do. And so I want to, whoever wants to take this on the panel, Moen, if you want to start, maybe you can give us some words of wisdom to help us with this.
So one competency that became very clear to us, so I run a very sophisticated team of data scientists, and you talked very well, Eamon, about the competency you need to go to market. Well, actually what becomes really interesting is the competency you need to be data literate in marketing and product management. And why I say that is you have to sort of think about what does it mean when you're building a product that is beyond data wrapping. You're building an algorithm. What does it mean? And so we're finding this really interesting thing where the implication of having a cognitive computing or machine learning algorithm, for instance, we serve our financial services in risk, so we're helping them manage risk, protect themselves in situations like counterparty risk. So if you're delivering information and you as a customer are reading or consuming the data, that's one thing. If I have an algorithm that is going to tell you things about the risk you might be exposed to, then I have to really understand not only what I'm selling, what I'm designing as a product, what are the implications of the algorithm. Is the algorithm going to be self-learning? What does that mean? And there is tremendous implication. Okay, there's legal implication, reputational implication. You need the client to truly understand that they're consuming the output, the data from an algorithm, and those are people that may have never interfaced with a tool that's sophisticated. So you're really looking across the product lifecycle, starting from the ideation and then understanding the implication of these things. I mean, we're starting to talk about, machine evolving, machine-produced data. What does that actually mean? And do your people understand what they're getting? So I think this is a really emerging area that is going to require literacy at minimum,
Right.
to even be able to have those conversations.
And it seems that much more important to have that customer relationship we were just talking about, to
Absolutely.
really understand what the end game is, how the use is happening, to make sure end to end you become responsible
Exactly.
for the implications. Anything on this topic, Ivan, or?
I think our big worries in this area are around reputational risk and I guess contractual risk. Data security, you touched on in a previous one, but a lot of the data that we handle is client data. And so when we think about controlling the data and the use of the cloud, we think about ensuring we're complying with regulatory requirements around privacy, that we're complying with contractual requirements around how the data can be used. And we spend an enormous amount of time validating our right to use the data in the way we would like, or obtaining the rights to use that data. So those are a couple areas that we particularly focus on.
Yeah. So question for you, James. What about the idea of partnering? In one sense, that is one of the risks we encountered is partner risks, because again, as you are sharing data, you have risks associated with that. But just the importance of partnering for an information business. It seems like, I don't think I've seen an information business yet that hasn't been reliant tremendously on ecosystems and the partners involved in that. Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah, I was going to
how that
mention
plays?
it in the context of the risk you were talking about, because Nielsen obviously spends a lot of time working with partners to augment the information they have to make it interesting and viable to the customers, right? So things like credit scores, for instance, or big information firms, their insights into the individuals from a device ID perspective. And so managing those interactions, doing the joins of that data in a way which is secure, which doesn't give up the private PII information to that client, to that partner, is a very difficult environment. And we build heavily sandboxed environments with those partners to do that, to be careful about how we deal with our assets and make sure that we don't lose that information bleeding out further than we expect it to, and that any data flow is carefully understood. And they're heavily architected. They're very secure systems, often air-gapped systems, in order to make sure that we're very confident the data's not going anywhere. And that slows down innovation, but we're so careful about that because it's so critical to the success of the partnership.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I was going to mention, when Mona was talking about algorithms, Thomson Reuters has been doing that for a little while with very careful innovation around the use, the news sentiment feed, right? So the news is a feed which is very commonly used by banks and hedge funds. And Reuters started publishing a sentiment flag which said, is this news positive or negative? But we wouldn't want people to trade off that because it's delivered by an algorithm, and we're not, entirely confident whether that algorithm is 100% correct all the time. Right? So I think that a lot of that innovation started to come out of those kind of use cases to understand how clients wanted to use it, what we were comfortable with, what they were willing to do.
Right. So as we embark on wrapping and add data and analytics in order to differentiate our products, it's clear we want to do this well. We don't want the reputational risk associated with some of issues that we were just kind of suggesting. And the problem with wrapping is it's a reputational risk of a core offering potentially that might have a very strong revenue stream. So we really don't want to mess up a product that exists. What about the idea of sustainable advantage, sustainable differentiation? Because if I'm a manufacturer and all of a sudden I'm enriching my product with data and analytics in order to free myself from commoditization, there are costs involved in that. And so what's the risk that I'm adding to cost structure without necessarily adding sustainable advantage? Maybe it's a short-lived advantage and others will catch up quickly, and then all of a sudden I have a product that's no longer profitable. So how do you sustain advantage? I guess that's the question in an information world. Is this about patents? Is this about protecting very advanced type of algorithms that would be irreplicable? What's the secret here to making sure that someone else isn't going to jump in and just do what you're doing?
I think
James?
if you build a good information service and clients use it, it's incredibly sticky. I think that the best example I ever had was when I was working with a client and we wanted to shut an API down which they were using, and they said you can't because we don't have the source code for the application anymore, so we can't actually modify it to work with the new API, right? So I think you end up being embedded in the in the infrastructure of the firm, the client, right? And can be a good thing if you're a good client and a good information provider, but it can be a bad thing if not, right? And I think that providing you design the systems well, they're incredibly sticky and hopefully delivering value. I think on the client side, you can abstract yourself out of that stuff, but the problem is you end up going to lowest common denominator, which often destroys the value of a high-value API, right?
Yeah.
Or a high-value service.
And just to let you know, about 5 minutes, we'd love to open up for questions. So please start thinking of some questions that you'd like to ask us. So embeddedness comes up quite a bit. The more embedded you can become in terms of processes, in terms of consumer types of wrapping, then the more you can become the patterns of someone's behavioral routines. That kind of embeddedness is other strategies other than that, or is that really what this is all about?
There's, I guess, three things that we tend to think about. One is we try to focus on areas that are somehow close to our core, right, where we have some expertise. So they're either tightly associated with a core product, like an analytics tool or custody or accounting operations. And then we focus on data that's really differentiated, right, where we think we have something that no one or very few others have, right, and that helps sustain some of that. And then we use our data scientists and our researchers to validate the use of the data. Someone was at drinks last night, and someone was asking me, "Do you guys use Twitter feeds?" And part of the problem with Twitter feeds is there's an enormous noise in a Twitter feed, and so it makes it very difficult to use. So we have not tended to focus on that. Just an example of what one of the products we launched is we're the largest administrator of private equity firms. So we do the accounting for private equity firms, which means we see all the cash flows of the private equity industry around the world. So we went out and asked 3,000 GPs and LPs if we can aggregate and anonymize that data, and they agreed to let us do that. And then we were able to create an index that actually shows what the global market looks like and the performance of the private equity industry. No one else can replicate that because we're doing all of the accounting for the industry. And so that's the niche that we decided to focus on and provide that back. So it's really that, identifying those niches where we can be differentiated.
Mm-hmm. I was been following the tweets. If you're not, I highly recommend it. It's very entertaining. It's wonderful to see what people are identifying as some of the key ideas and nuggets. And someone mentioned that one topic that hasn't been coming up yet, except for once, was talent. And I feel like it's almost an elephant in the room, right? We're talking about all of these really exciting opportunities associated with data, but we all know that there's quite a talent shortage out there. So I'd be interested in some of your talent strategies or your perspective on talent for this business, because clearly when you're working almost entirely with data and analytics, I'm assuming this is a big deal for you all. Is that the case? Yes? No?
I think
Motta?
yes. I mean, we just, we had a conversation a couple of days ago with a large group of financial services. Look, I think data scientists get really excited about working on good problems and have access to data. So I think this idea of having, that James mentioned, of having your data within your wall in order to make it accessible and be able to experiment is kind of a key. It's actually quite interesting to find, we talk to a lot of people in various industries and how difficult that is. So you don't want to hire a really smart machine learning expert and just have him spend 6 months trying to chase someone who can give him access to a database, right? So there are sort of enabling behaviors that just can tell you come and can create value. I think the talent's there. I think what's really difficult for large companies is to think about access to talent that's no longer traditional and just within the wall of their firm, and just sort of think about talent as something that's a little bit more fluid. There are people who will work for you. There are people who will be in startups and will be plugged into a business model that enables you to work with them. There are people who will do long horizon work at universities. We work with MIT and a lot of top-notch universities that help us look at the future. So I think that's the way you solve that. You have to sort of think about that problem a little bit more creatively, at least on the front end innovations.
I see you nodding, James.
I was, Mona and I have thought about this. Fundamentally, you need to attract data scientists. You need data, right? You need good data. That's where they want to come. That's the sandbox, the playpen you're going to give them, right? So, if you've got great data, interesting data, unique data, to Ivan's point, I think that's really important. The second thing, have you got an environment? And this is Mona's point. Have you got an environment that allows them to be effective, or are you going to give them, an old laptop, or tell them, do an ETL out of that database and then carry the floppy disk from here to here? If you give them, and they've come from an environment where they're working at MIT and they just think that's, you're wasting my time. I'm doing trivial work, right? So I think it's both having the data, which is key, and having the environment, the platform on which they can innovate.
Yeah. So there's the data science talent,
Yep.
when we're talking about the features themselves. But then there's talent in the rest of the organization. So for instance, if we're talking about enriching product, we're talking about, for instance, the product organization and product development processes and such, which aren't necessarily data scientists. What about that talent? Does there need to be shifts from for instance, appreciation of evidence-based decision-making or analytics and such? I mean, are you finding that, Ivan, or how does that? What's the talent that's needed kind of throughout the organization?
So, I think we went up a pretty steep learning curve. We underestimated how different it would be to develop and sell some of these products. So we did a lot of hiring in the product management area. But actually, I think that our biggest surprise was on the sales side. It ended up that the buying centers were different, even though we were selling in many cases to the same client. The individuals or the cost centers that were buying were different. The salespeople that we had didn't have experience selling these products or calling on the right people. And so that is an area where we've had to make enormous investment, is building up from scratch a sales organization that was skilled at commercializing these capabilities.
Yeah.
Particularly when you're trying to sell higher value analytics, right? Where often an internal part of the firm will say, well, give me the raw data and I'll build that analytic myself, right? So you're having a conversation that's very different.
Right. Well, we'd love to open up for some questions. So I think we're going to, Michael's going to move the microphone. Are you going to move it to the middle, or? Please. There we go.
While they're moving mics, one of the sorry, Tom Edwards, I'm also from Nielsen. One of the challenges I found a lot is that with a data product, ongoing consistent data quality is one of the most important attributes of value. But it's very hard to sell that to someone in the sales cycle because they're always used to buying on features and attributes and capabilities. And then once you've delivered, they take the quality for granted until something goes wrong, and then they're saying, I don't want to pay anymore. So is that a problem that you've experienced, and how do you make, with all the rigor and hard work, which is the ongoing high quality delivery, how do you make the client realize that value?
Yeah. I'm not going to answer my own
Yeah.
question. I mean, I think that was the point I was making, which is that there is this perception that data has been commoditized. And I think that moving the bits from A to B may have been commoditized, but actually the process, the supply chain that we use to acquire that data is extremely complex and difficult to reproduce and shouldn't be underestimated by anyone. And I think the point is how do you make sure that people understand that value, particularly if you start selling a data-only product, how do you make sure that that value is correctly assigned, right? If there's a piece of integration work where consultants might do that work, or if it's part of a broader piece of integration, it can be hard to make sure the value is there.
I don't have an answer to your question, but I'll echo that people are being challenged by this because when I running the product management team for the software company, I got a lot of requests for new features. And it used to be that our customers would just ask me for more algorithms in our machine learning module. But increasingly, they're pushing me for data sanitization and data preparation functions. They're being challenged about the dirtiness of the data so much more that they're asking us to put in functions that will, will clean up the data before they run the analysis, so we'll normalize it, and then afterwards we'll tell them how good their models are. So I'm seeing a big uptick in requests for that. So I'll echo that they must be being challenged by it as much as you are.
I know from some of our cases what it goes back to is where we kind of started, the importance of that end-to-end understanding and appreciation of the process and what you're actually doing with the data. So for instance, in the context of insurance firms, if you have a slight change in the quality of the algorithm and the data, you potentially have a slight change in your risk process or the risk that you're accepting, but that small change is actually, bazillion dollars in the insurance world. And so in those times where quality matters, articulating exactly how much in a quantified way, showing through application, I think that gets you pretty far. I don't know if you've been asked to do this, Ivan, because obviously, maybe it's so obvious that having the actual data of private firms, but at some point I would suspect you'll have to differentiate yourself from other opportunities of valuation, maybe more just environmental indicators that, a startup might be saying can get you to the same outcome. Even if, does that make sense? It seems like you would need to, again, continue to really show that the quality that you're bringing is quality and meaningful quality, and this is why.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's the basic work, which is you've got to validate that the data is accurate and there's integrity in the data, right? And that is a little bit table stakes, but I think people do underestimate how hard and expensive it is to do that. But what we try to do is then use our researchers, as I alluded to earlier, to try to show some insights out of the data, right? Because at the end of the day, the data is only valuable if you can get some insights out of it that are actionable and that you can, in most of our cases, a client can make investment decisions with.
Yeah.
It's always pretty obvious in Nielsen when people are unhappy about data quality because it's a currency, right? People are buying and selling based on the Nielsen numbers, right? And I think that is, it shows how sticky the data is. But the problem, I think that Tom points out, the problem is, can you make sure that clients understand that that's so valuable to them, right? Often they don't want to think of it.
They don't want to pay for that.
Right. Yes, please.
Yeah,
Great panel. I love the real world experience. I'll first make an observation, then ask a question. The observation is that all of the stories that we have here start with a company that has over decades amassed a ton of data about an industry or business.
Yeah.
Can you contrast that or say, is it even possible to begin a data business if you don't start from there? Can you identify a need and then go hunting for the data that might support it? Or is that a failing exercise? I'm interested in the startup problem.
All right, I'll give you an example because it's local and I love it. And it's sort of mind-blowing example I use with large CIOs because it's the idea that you really have to think creatively and out of the box. So there's a gentleman here who happened to be an expert in maritime studies and happened to be a lawyer. And because of that joint expertise, negotiated a exclusive right to container-level ship data, which then turned out to be quite valuable to start understanding some trading pattern. And originally, he started trying to sell that to companies like us to combine with our financial data, but it's actually so valuable that he turned it into a hedge fund, and it's a local company. So that's a real story of starting from an idea and a weird expertise and being able to get the data. I think, personally, I think beyond wrapping and selling, we are about to enter a world where there's going to be some really fascinating data marketplaces and a real sort of thinking about what happens between open data and the very proprietary data and what could happen when you start thinking about selling it, combining it, mashing it together, and starting entirely new businesses.
I think there's a lot of data sets that people are looking at for additional signals, right? And I think that it's often not the acquisition of that data, often it's publicly available data, but can you get a unique access to that, or can you provide a unique analytic on top of that? And that's the business. There was an example of a firm we saw a few years ago where they built a business out of analytics around media consumption for music, right? Using social media, using the same source sales, using the record labels and the individual artists. And they built a very interesting data business out of all that data mashed together and selling both sides of that market depending on who wants to buy it. So I think plenty of opportunity.
Yeah, I have an example of somebody who didn't create the data originally, making lots of money out of it. So there is one telco company, a cell phone carrier using Vertica, and they look at the signals of where people are roaming around, with Vertica, and they can figure out that you drove by a certain billboard on the freeway, that you saw an ad, and then they sell that data to retailers to tell them whether or not that ad was worthwhile. But then I heard of a hedge fund that purchased the same data from the cell phone carrier and is now selling that to traders to advise them to buy or sell stocks based on it. So they just started with the idea.
And there's going to be numerous business coming out of IoT data streams, right? The question is, what insight can you bring, right?
Yeah.
We work with a number of startups, a lot of which are associated with academics. So it's not that the data itself is so unique, but it's the thinking they can apply to how you scrub and interpret the data that's interesting. And the reason they like working with us or other large companies is they've got the intellectual property, they've got the idea, they don't have the distribution. Right? And so what we can help them with is getting that out to the client base.
Great. Please.
Quick questions, okay? When you have like a data products, okay, you have identified one client that want it and it's so unique, but developing it will be so costly, okay? How do you go about kind of testing the market, make sure not just that one client get it, but everyone's want that data too?
So the example I was mentioning in our legal services actually started with what we call a design advisory group. So we brought several law firms together. It was actually quite I'm pretty proud of my colleagues innovating like this. We entered a rather crowded marketplace with legal solutions. And the way we did it is we brought 4 or 5 key law firms and sort of made sure there was some repeatability. And that repeatability question is really difficult, but I think it can be managed by identifying patterns of customers that could, in our case, could really become a market. If you can sell to 4 or 5 large banks or the 4 or 5 large law firms, you're starting to see a trend. I think if you can get there, that's quite powerful.
Yeah. Anyone else on that? No?
A question about, actually, you mentioned earlier, Ivan, you mentioned earlier the notion of asking permission to aggregate the data and then reflect it back out as a product. But when you think about these data products that are sometimes derived from data where the ownership is sort of between 2 organizations, is there an unsolved problem here about when you're required to eliminate a customer's data, or when you're required to, for example, retrain your algorithm, eliding some data that you no longer have access to? Is everybody just kind of going with the flow on that, or is there actually some established best practices around ownership of data, and in particular ownership of trained models?
You know, I don't think there are. It varies a little bit by industry, right? Some industries are more regulated than others, and there are more clear rules in some industries, like the medical industry, about how you can use the data, or in financial services as well. You know, our default position is to be very conservative with the use of the data, by and large, to a large degree, because reputation is so important to us. We're their custodian; they have to trust us. If they can't trust us with the data, we don't have a business. So we tend to default on the very conservative side of how we use the data.
I don't think there are good best practices. I know our customers build models based on a huge number of customers, and I haven't heard of cases where they throw away the model or try to rebuild it when they lose one of those key customers.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know best practices, but I think it is exactly, part of that data acquisition supply chain, which is so difficult to do well, right? If you think about what Nielsen does, it takes data from a lot of different sources, and some of those providers of the data say, I'm okay with you aggregating that data and anonymizing that data, but I don't want my competitors to be able to see that data, and clearly that's a key contractual issue associated with the data. So I think that's very important. The FX business at Thomson Reuters, where each individual publisher of prices may want some people to see those prices and not others, and so negative and positive permissioning. I think there are plenty of examples in these information businesses, because they're so mature. I'm not sure that they're widely understood, and I think that's part of the point of the supply chain, the acquisition of that data, why it is so complex, because it isn't just a question of building a big data lake and data mining. Right?
Yeah, no, that's actually great. Actually, and is there a distinction when you talk about the Vertica customers? Is this like consumer level data, or that kind of high value, client data? Because I think in consumer businesses, the assumption is like nobody cares.
Well, because they're less regulated, right? But they're not all consumer examples. We have one customer who's using Vertica to analyze how doctors interact with information systems in the hospitals. But they've ended up they didn't start out this way. At first, they were just trying to improve their systems, their applications. But over the years, they've ended up selling information back to these clinics about which doctors do what on a Wednesday, et cetera. And they've now started to rank departments, and they'll say, you know, these pathologists spend less time doing their paperwork, they're more efficient. That's not consumer data, it should be very regulated. And I think it's pretty dangerous. I mean, if one of those doctors leaves or gets sued for malpractice, I think they should change their models, but I don't know that that happens.
And we're studying it right now, so if you give me a year, I'll have some report back. Okay, sounds good. So I would love to give everyone the opportunity to have that one last comment, either about how you can save us all from some disastrous mistake that we will make. How can you prevent that? Or words of wisdom. So what can you share to really help us move off and do some great wrapping with our digitization efforts? No pressure.
No pressure, Ivan.
You want me to start? Go ahead. I think our learning has been that it takes longer and it's harder than we expected. But the rewards, I think, are great. I mean, we've been at this for 3 years now. We're really starting to get some traction. The clients really appreciate it, and we're starting to grow very quickly. But it took longer than we thought to get going.
Yeah.
So I think, it's even though I'm an engineer, I think you start with really understanding the customer problem, the technology, and the rest follows. And just really thinking about it across all the way from ideation, marketing, to the sales channel, to the service, like the whole end-to-end. I think those are really just key to start thinking that way.
None of my customers who do this really well started out by thinking they were going to come up with an info product to sell to their customers. They all started out by building a system that improved customer support in some way. And that earns the customer's trust in the way that they're then willing to give you the data. And from that, they were able to figure out insights to sell them. But I think they had to start from that.
Great, yeah.
I think data's a product, just like any other product. You need to think about ease of use, right? If you really want to get your data product embedded and sticky inside your customers, you need to think about how easy it's going to be to let them leverage that and address the issues around lock-in and ease of use and redistribution. If you don't do those things up front, you're going to be surprised when an ecosystem of companies sits on top of your data and commoditizes you, or nobody uses it because it's too damned hard to use in the first place.
Yeah. So I hope this panel's given you something to think about. I will tell you, we have quite a bit of research in this area. If you go to MIT Scissor's website, we disseminate all of our research products for free to the world. So all you have to do is go to our website, sign up for free registration, and it is yours. We have several briefings, 3-page briefings right up. So for instance, in December, I wrote a briefing called Profiting from the Data Deluge that talks about wrapping and selling and improving and what it takes to do those. We also have a number of case studies on information businesses, for instance, if you want to really look under the hood to see how some of their processes work and what their business model looks like and such. So I hope you take advantage of those resources because we're here to help. That's the mission of Scissor. And I hope now you will actually help me thank a wonderful, wonderful panel of experts in this area. Thank you.